Hello, this is Ben Moore, Finance Manager for the Office of Community Assistance, and this video will help walk you through budgeting for indirect costs. The line items covered in this video are 317, which is in the administration category. If your agency elects to claim indirect costs, the cost will be charged to the 317 budget line item and are considered part of the total administrative allocation for each grant and cannot be charged to any program support budget line item. Please remember that the indirect cost base is for each grant, it's not for your whole agency. The steps required to claim indirect costs are as follows. The first step is to enter the indirect cost rate information on Section A and the ICI tab. Again, ICI stands for Indirect Cost Information. Step 2 is to complete the supporting documentation that corresponds to the type of indirect cost rate your agency is using. If you are using the modified total direct cost, or what we call MTDC, which is the 10% de minimis, you would submit the modified total direct cost calculator. For the negotiated indirect cost rate, you would submit the calculator for what we call NICRA. Step 3 is to complete the indirect cost tab on the budget spreadsheet with the information from the indirect cost calculator and narrative information. Step 1, entering the indirect cost rate information on Section A and the ICI tab. You would go to the Section A tab and enter the indirect rate and base below line 317, indirect costs. And that's right down here in this, at the example at the bottom of the slide there. So you would enter, for the rate, you would enter the percentage. Again, if you're using the de minimis rate, you would use 10%. If you were using a negotiated rate, you would enter the rate from your federal or state NICRA, which again is the negotiated indirect cost rate agreement. For the base, you would enter the descriptive information, not dollars. So if you look at the example here on the screen in the yellow cells at the bottom there, the rate percentage is your percentage, either 10% for de minimis or your negotiated rate. And for the base, you put in a descriptive explanation of the base, not the dollar amount. So for the modified total direct cost, you would simply enter MTDC. For the negotiated rate, you would enter the categories utilized, such as salaries, travel, etc., as listed in your federal or state NICRA. So one of the most common indirect bases for a negotiated rate would be salaries or salaries and fringe, something like that. So please describe clearly what base calculation method, what basis you are using, specifically if you have a negotiated rate. For the MTDC, it will always just be MTDC. You need to enter the indirect cost rate information on Section A and again the ICI tab. So for the ICI information, you would go to the ICI tab and check the box next to the indirect rate you are electing to use. If option 1 or 2 are selected here in this example on the left, you will need to complete the negotiated indirect cost rate agreement information at the bottom of the tab as well. And that's what these yellow highlighted fields are, and they are at the bottom of the tab. For the purposes of this slide, we've just taken a little screenshot, but that is if you're selecting options 1 or 2A. Step 2 is the required supporting documentation. So again, if you're using the 10% de minimis, or if you're using it temporarily until your negotiated rate is approved, you need to complete the modified total direct cost, or the MTDC calculator. If you're using the federal negotiated rate, you need to provide a copy of the approved federal NICRA. Also complete an indirect calculator for negotiated rates. If you're using a state negotiated rate, you would provide a copy of the approved state NICRA. Again, you would complete an indirect cost calculator for negotiated rates. Both calculators have been detailed step-by-step, detailed step-by-step instructions on how to complete the spreadsheet right within that document. Carefully follow the instructions to accurately complete the calculator. Here is a screenshot of the MTDC calculator. This one happens to be for CSBG, but they are all essentially the same. you enter the information for your agency, and then you follow the instructions here in the blue boxes that tell you how to complete the total amounts here for each budget line item. Essentially, you are entering the budget line items that are allowable to be utilized as part of your modified total direct cost basis. This is another screenshot of the bottom of the spreadsheet. Again, the blue boxes here walk you step by step through, but essentially after you put in your base and any exclusions that are not allowed to be included in the base, this calculator, this spreadsheet, will help you calculate the amount that is allowable for you to claim as an indirect rate. Again, 10% is the default percentage if you're using de minimis, and the spreadsheet will walk you through exactly what fields and what amounts to put on the indirect cost tab of the budget spreadsheet itself. Again, this is the third section of the spreadsheet, and after calculating the main part of the base, the exclusions, it will walk you through how to complete or what numbers to use in the indirect cost tab. And down here, this highlighted green cell will get you the amount that you need to transfer over to the indirect cost tab on the GATA budget spreadsheet. This one is the indirect cost calculator for negotiated rates. It is very similar to the MTDC calculator, except that it is not quite as automated in that you need to enter only the budget categories that are included in the base for your rate. Again, most common are salaries and fringe, so it's likely that these first two budget line items and the administrative personnel and fringe may likely be the only items you enter here, but it is particular to your basis that has been agreed upon in your negotiated rate. So you'll need to make sure that you refer to that and fill in the correct budget fields here. And again, similar to the MTDC calculator, it walks down, and if there are any exclusions, you would enter them here. And ultimately, in this green box at the bottom, it will calculate your allowed indirect cost that you can transfer to your indirect cost tab on the budget spreadsheet. So now that we've looked at some examples of screenshots of the spreadsheet, I'm going to walk you through the steps in completing it. So for the MTDC calculator, first you must enter all the budgeted direct costs for this grant, this particular grant, the program support, the client assistance, direct administration. If there happen to be any special line items in the 400 series, you would enter them all as I showed at the top of the calculator. Then you would enter any exclusions, in particular equipment, rent and rent assistance, scholarships, fellowships, tuitions, participant support costs, and test registrations are some examples, and then a portion of any subawards or subcontracts are also considered exclusions. As far as the equipment, and that amount, as long as you enter the correct amount in the budget portion at the top of the spreadsheet, it will auto-populate to lower down in the spreadsheet in the exclusion section. So it will pull that number right from the equipment line item. As far as rent and rent assistance, you have to actually manually enter any rent from any tabs that are included in your budget. Put them down in that section and it will exclude them. The same thing for scholarships, fellowships, any of the other exclusions, you need to manually enter those if they're applicable. Then the MTDC base subtotal minus the exclusions will calculate your MTDC base, and then the MTDC base is multiplied by 10 because it's 10% is the de minimis rate for those using the MTDC election, and so that will equal your maximum indirect cost per the indirect cost rate. So then you need to determine the allowed indirect cost budget. So there are 4 limiting factors in how much indirect cost you can claim. So those factors help determine the final amount of indirect cost that you can budget on the spreadsheet. So what you have already budgeted out of your total grant leaves the funds remaining to be budgeted. Your total admin allocation for this grant can also limit the amount you can claim as indirect, because the indirect costs, line 317, plus the rest of the 300 series, which are your direct administration lines, those two added together cannot exceed your allowed admin max for the particular grant you're budgeting. And the third item is that what you have already budgeted in direct admin leaves the remaining admin allocation available, which is part of what I was explaining in item 2, that your total allowed admin can limit how much you can claim as indirect cost. So the maximum allowed indirect based on your indirect rate is also a limiting factor. We now need to determine the allowed indirect cost budget amount. The calculator is set up to take these limiting factors that I mentioned on the previous slide into account and to calculate the final allowed indirect cost you can budget. Because of these limiting factors, you can only claim the smallest of the 4 amounts in this section. So once this is calculated, step 6 below shows you the 3 items you need to copy over to the indirect tab of the budget template. So again, if you follow the instructions in the boxes here to the side of the grid, we try to walk you through exactly how to enter the information into this spreadsheet to get the correct indirect amount. So if you'll see in this box at the bottom, labeled step 6, that's green, it shows you that the items marked 1, 2, and 3 on this section of the MTDC calculator are to be transferred over to the indirect tab on the budget template. Now we'll walk through the steps to complete the cost calculator for indirect rates. We've just covered the modified total direct cost approach. Now we're going to address how you would do this if you have a negotiated indirect rate. So to calculate the base and the allowed indirect, the details of how you complete the calculator for indirect rates depends largely on the details of the negotiated rate agreement for your agency. Each one is different, but we tried to provide examples of those that are most common. So you need to enter all budgeted direct costs that are included in your negotiated base. For this grant alone, for example, if direct salaries and fringe are your negotiated base, then you would add the ones from personnel, the direct salaries from personnel and direct admin, also the fringe benefits under personnel and direct admin. If your base is total direct costs excluding some particular cost, then you would go ahead and fill in all budgeted amounts in the base calculator portion, and then we will exclude the specific amounts in the exclusion section. As far as entering the exclusions, we've listed here some of the most common exclusions that we've seen on negotiated indirect cost rates. So sometimes it's fringe benefits, so you would enter the fringe amount from the program support and the admin fringe lines. Again, only if they're included in your base calculation. Capital expenditures, this will likely only come from the equipment line. Often is the portion of each subaward or subcontract over $25,000. So you would enter each subaward subcontract on the subaward listing tab. You would fill out all columns, and the tab will calculate the amount to exclude, which you transfer to the indirect calculated exclusion section. Oftentimes, flow-through funds are excluded on some negotiated rates, so the costs that do not require the full range of management services and would result in a distorted distribution of indirect costs. So any other items that are excluded as part of your NIPRE, you would enter into that exclusion section. So now you need to determine the allowed indirect cost budget amount. So there are 3 limiting factors in this case that determine the final amount of indirect costs. So there is your total admin allocation for the grant. Again, indirect is included in that, so that could be a limiting factor. Another item is what you have already budgeted in direct admin, so that leaves the remaining admin allocation available for indirect. So the maximum allowed indirect base on your indirect rate. Obviously that is going to be a limiting factor as well. So your indirect base subtotal minus any exclusions, that's going to result in your indirect base. You then take your indirect base and multiply it times your negotiated rate. As you remember in the MTDC example, you always multiply it by 10%, but since each negotiated rate is unique, you need to enter the negotiated rate for your agreement. And that calculation equals the maximum indirect cost for the indirect cost rate. Again, to determine the allowed indirect cost budget amount for a negotiated rate, the calculator is set up to take the three limiting factors that we discussed on the previous slide into account and to calculate the final allowed indirect cost you can budget. So because of these limiting factors, again, you can only claim the smallest of the three amounts in this section. So once this is calculated, step 6 below will show you the three items that you need to copy over to the indirect tab of the budget template. So again, this green box at the bottom after you walk through all the steps, it shows you that items 1, 2, and 3 listed here are the specific items that you would carry over, and you would then enter those into the indirect cost tab of the budget template to calculate your allowable indirect cost. So step 3 of the process is completing the indirect cost tab. So if you remember at the bottom of the cost calculator, the green section there told you that there are three items that you need to carry over to this tab. And so in the bright yellow box under the description, you would use one of these brief descriptions. For you would use 10% de minimis rate if you're using the MTDC, federal negotiated rate, or state negotiated rate, depending on what kind of calculation you're using for indirect costs. And you would enter that in the description section here. So as far as completing the indirect cost tab, the minimum requirements for the cost grid detail are that you need to carry the three numbered items from either the MTDC calculator or the indirect calculator for negotiated rates onto this tab, as we just explained. So number 1 here will go in the base. Number 2, the item number 2 listed here, in this case it's 0%, but it would have the appropriate rate. That goes under the rate on the tab. Number 3 will go to the right of the big gray box as the adjustment. So if the adjustment was a negative number on the calculator, enter it as a negative here. So the adjustment is typically needed if your allowed indirect puts you over your maximum allowed admin. So if your direct admin plus what you potentially could be eligible to claim as indirect puts you over your allowed maximum admin, you'll need to include an adjustment to come up with what you can really claim. So the minimum requirements for the cost grid on the negotiated rate is you carry the three numbered items from either the MTDC calculator or the indirect calculator for negotiated rates onto this tab. Again, the number 1 goes on the base, and number 2 will go on the rate, and number 3 will go to the right of the big gray box, as we mentioned, as an adjustment. So here's where the adjustment comes into play, and it will help calculate your total indirect cost that you can actually claim on this grant. So the minimum requirements for the narrative section. If you are utilizing a negotiated rate, then you need to provide the rate used and give description of what items are included in the base. For example, if it's a federal or state NICRA, you would give your rate, and then for the base you would explain what cost categories are included in your base. In this example, we've got salaries and wages plus fringe. Another example might be direct salaries excluding fringe. It may be total direct cost excluding capital expenditures, or that portion of each subaward that is in excess of $25,000 in flow-through funds. So these are just some examples that we have seen on actual negotiated cost rates, so we thought we'd provide those examples. So, and you would add any other base from your approved NICRA. So the minimum requirements for the narrative section of the indirect cost tab are that you need to give a brief description of items that you plan to charge in your indirect cost pool. Do not just list MTDC or the items in your indirect base. So please note that the indirect cost pool should only include costs that cannot be clearly allocated to specific programs or grants. An example is the portion of the executive director's salary that cannot reasonably be charged to direct admin or financial audit expense, in-house IT troubleshooting and support charges, and security expenses, say an alarm company or security personnel. Those are all reasonable costs that could be included in the indirect cost pool. But if there is something that is readily identifiable as a direct cost to a particular program or grant, it cannot be included in the indirect cost pool. So we want you to give a description of what kind of costs you intend on including in the indirect cost pool. So you would also use the narrative to explain if you are choosing to claim less indirect cost than your MTDC calculator or your indirect calculator allows you to claim, and the reason. So most often that would be due to the administrative cap, or you may just choose to claim more direct admin than you are potentially allowed on the indirect. So since you have an admin cap, if you choose to not utilize all the allowable indirect, we need a little explanation here so that we know that you didn't just make a math error and not claim everything that you're allowed to. So for negotiated rate users, if it is difficult to see what makes up each of the exclusions and where those amounts come from, please explain them clearly here and where you got the amounts. That'll avoid us having to come back and ask you follow-up questions. That concludes our video on indirect costs. I want to remind you that we do have separate videos available as guides to completing each of the individual cost tabs in the budget spreadsheet. Thanks for watching.